Picture a morning in Zambia, sometime around 299,000 years ago. The sun is rising over a landscape that does not yet have a name. The air smells of dry grass and distant rain. Somewhere in that landscape, a person is waking up. We do not know what they looked like in the way we know what we look like. The brow above their eyes projected forward in heavy ridges that no living human face carries. The skull behind those eyes was long and low, rather than high and rounded. But the brain inside that skull was large, close in volume to yours. The hands that pushed against the ground as they rose were hands that had learned things, that remembered things, that had held tools and fires and other hands. That person lived. They moved through a world that was fully real to them, with its own dangers and its own beauty, its own people and its own sky. They did not know they were archaic. They did not know they were living at the exact moment when the first people who looked like us were also alive. Somewhere else in realms, on the same continent, under the same African sun. They left behind a skull. In 1921, a mining worker in what was then northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, broke through a cave wall and found it. The skull traveled to London, where it has been ever since, in the collection of the Natural History Museum, catalogued and studied and argued over across 100 years of changing science. For most of that century, the skull was understood as very old, a safely distant representative of the archaic past. Then, in 2020, a team led by scientist Rainer Gruen of Griffith University in Australia published a direct dating analysis using methods applied to the fossil itself. The result placed the skull at approximately 299,000 years before the present. That date changed everything about what the skull means, because 299,000 years ago is exactly when the earliest known modern humans were alive, at a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, on the same continent. Two different kinds of human being, alive in Africa at the same time, close enough in geological terms to be neighbors, different enough in anatomy to belong to entirely separate chapters of the human story. The paper was published. It was read. And then it moved, as findings that complicate clean stories tend to move, toward the margins of the conversation rather than the center. The skull is still in London. The person who owned it has been gone for nearly 300,000 years. And the question of what their existence means for the story of where we came from has not yet been fully answered. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. This is a long story, and it begins much earlier than the mining accident that brought that skull into the light. It begins at the moment when human beings first tried to understand where we came from, and found that the answer kept changing every time they looked more carefully at what the ground had preserved. The past is not a settled place. It is an argument the earth is still making, one bone at a time. Chapter 1. The bones that set the timeline. Start with what is not in dispute. Every scientific framework needs a foundation, a set of findings solid enough to build on, tested enough to trust. The foundation of human origins, science was built across roughly 150 years of excavation, measurement, and debate. By the early years of this century, it had produced a picture that most researchers accepted as the best available account of where modern humans came from and when. The picture looked like this. Our species, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa. The oldest fossils that qualify as anatomically modern humans, meaning skulls and skeletons, with the specific combination of features we associate with living people today, were found on the African continent. For decades, the oldest confirmed examples came from sites in Ethiopia, Omo Kibish and Herto, two sites in the Ethiopian Rift Valley. Produced remains dated to approximately 195,000 and 160,000 years before the present respectively. Those dates were accepted, replicated, and became anchor points in the standard account. Then, in 2017, A team working at a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco published a finding that moved the anchor point significantly. The fossils recovered there, including a partial skull with distinctly modern features, were dated using thermoluminescence of burned flint found in the same sediment layer to approximately 300,000 years before the present. This was not a minor revision. It pushed the confirmed origin of our species back by roughly 100,000 years. And it shifted the geographic picture as well, suggesting that anatomically modern humans were present across a much wider range of Africa earlier than the Ethiopian sites had implied. The Jebel Irhoud finding was not without debate. Some researchers pointed out that the facial features of the fossils were more modern than the brain cases, which retained some archaic characteristics, and asked whether these individuals truly qualified as fully modern humans or represented an earlier transitional form. That debate has not been fully resolved, but the finding was published in the journal Nature, subjected to extensive peer review, replicated through multiple dating methods, and is now cited in the mainstream scientific literature as evidence that modern humans, or something very close to modern humans, were present in Africa by 300,000 years ago. This matters because it illustrates something important about how the foundation itself was built. The timeline did not arrive complete. It was assembled piece by piece, and each piece required argument, and several of the most important pieces required earlier pieces to be moved. Understanding what makes a fossil count as anatomically modern is not as simple as it might sound from the outside. Paleoanthropologists define modern humans by a specific set of skeletal features present together in all living humans and absent or partial in earlier hominin species. The high rounded brain case, the reduced brow ridge, the vertical forehead, the flat mid-face, the presence of a chin. When a fossil has all of them, the classification is relatively straightforward. When a fossil has some of them and not others, the debate begins. That debate matters because the boundaries of the category determine what gets counted as evidence of modern human presence in a given place at a given time. A skull that has a modern brain case but archaic facial features might be classified differently by two equally qualified researchers. And that difference in classification can mean a difference of tens of thousands of years in the accepted timeline. Now, bring the person from the opening of this story back into the room. The skull they left behind has a massive brow ridge, a long, low brain case, a face that projects forward in ways no living human face does. By the anatomical standards the field uses to define our species, this person was not one of us. They belong to a group called Homo heidelbergensis, an archaic hominin species that appears in both the African and European fossil record before the emergence of modern humans. For most of the century, since their skull was found in that Zambian cave, they were assumed to be comfortably old, perhaps 500,000 years or more, a representative of the deep past that preceded us by a safe margin of geological time. The 2020 direct dating analysis by Rainer Grun's team changed that assumption. At approximately 299,000 years old, based on uranium series and electron spin resonance methods applied to the fossil itself rather than to surrounding sediment. This person was not comfortably distant. They were alive when the earliest modern humans at Jebel Irhoud were alive. Same continent. Same slice of geological time. Different enough in anatomy to belong to a different chapter of the human story, yet close enough in time to have potentially shared the same rivers, the same migration routes, the same African sky. What that means, exactly, is something the field is still working out. The direct dating result has been treated as a serious and significant finding in the literature, though some researchers have noted that the specific sampling location on the fossil introduces some uncertainty that warrants continued discussion. Science rarely offers a result so clean that every question dissolves at once. What it offers instead is better questions than it had before. And the Broken Hill date offers exactly that. Before you can fully understand why that date is significant, you need to understand the framework It complicates. You need to know the ruler before you can appreciate what it means when something does not quite measure up. The framework that emerged from 150 years of careful work is called the Out of Africa model. Its core claim is that all living humans descend primarily from a population that originated in Africa and spread across the rest of the world within the last 100,000 to 200,000 years, replacing or absorbing earlier hominin populations they encountered in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere. The genetic evidence for this model is strong. DNA studies of living human populations consistently show patterns of diversity, best explained by an African origin and a relatively recent dispersal. Populations in Africa carry more genetic diversity than populations outside it, which is exactly what you would expect if the non-African populations descended from a smaller founding group that left Africa and expanded outward. The Out of Africa model is not a fringe theory or a contested minority view. It is the consensus position of the field, supported by converging evidence from genetics, paleontology, and archaeology, but a consensus is not a closed question. It is the best current answer, held with the degree of confidence the evidence warrants, and revised when better evidence arrives. The history of human origins science is a history of consensus positions being refined, extended, and occasionally significantly adjusted as new methods and new discoveries have added to the picture. The bones that set the timeline did their job. They built a framework solid enough to stand on. What the framework is now being asked to accommodate is the fuller picture of who else was standing on the same ground, at the same time, in the same continent, when the first people who looked like us were first learning to recognize the sky, and that fuller picture begins with a skull in a London museum, and a person who woke up one morning in Zambia nearly 300,000 years ago, and has been waiting ever since for someone to ask the right question about when they lived. Chapter 2. The Finds That Don't Fit. There is a cave system in South Africa called Rising Star, where the rock walls narrow, in places, to a gap barely wide enough for a human body to pass through, sideways. In 2013, a recreational caver named Stephen Tucker squeezed through one of those gaps and found himself in a chamber that no one had entered for a very long time. The floor was covered in bones, not scattered randomly the way bones fall when an animal dies in a space, arranged in a way that took time to understand. The bones belonged to a previously unknown species of hominin. They were named Homo naledi, after the Sesotho word for star. And what they eventually revealed about the relationship between anatomy and behavior would quietly dismantle assumptions the field had held for decades. The anatomy was a contradiction that no one had seen before. The hands and feet of Homo naledi were essentially modern, well-suited for the precision grip and upright walking that we associate with our own species. The skull was not. The brain volume was roughly one-third the size of a modern human brain, closer in scale to hominins that lived millions of years before the present. By brain size alone, this creature seemed to belong to a chapter of human evolution that should have closed long before our own species appeared. The research team, led by paleoanthropologist Lee Berger of the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, initially assumed the fossils were very old. Something with a brain that small, the reasoning went, must have lived at a time when small-brained hominins were still the norm. 2Z. Estimates ranged as high as 2 million years before the present. Then, the dating results came back. Homo naledi lived between 235,000 and 335,000 years ago. Not 2 million years. At that moment in geological time, anatomically modern humans were already present in Africa. Homo naledi, with its ancient-looking brain and its modern-looking hands, had been the Broken Hill individual's contemporary, the same continent, the same slice of deep time, a completely different kind of being. Berger's team spent considerable time verifying this before publishing. The dating used multiple independent methods applied to both the fossils themselves and the surrounding sediment. The results were consistent enough to publish and strong enough to force the question that no one had quite asked before. How many different kinds of human beings were alive in Africa at the same time? But the date was not even the most unexpected part. Deep inside the cave system, in chambers that required navigating the same narrow passages that had made the initial discovery so difficult, researchers found evidence that Homo naledi had been depositing its dead in these chambers deliberately. The bones were not the remains of animals that had fallen in or been dragged by predators. They were arranged in ways consistent with intentional placement. Multiple individuals, adults and children, had been brought to these remote underground locations over what appears to have been an extended period of time. Deliberate disposal of the dead has long been considered a behavior associated with cognitively advanced hominins. The brain of Homo naledi was a third the size of ours. The behavior apparently attributed to it was one that researchers had previously considered a marker of modern cognitive capacity. Berger and his colleagues were careful about their language. They described the evidence as consistent with deliberate disposal, rather than claiming proof of ritual burial in the full modern sense. Consistent with means, the evidence does not contradict the interpretation. It does not mean the interpretation is confirmed. The field received the findings with genuine interest and appropriate caution. The claim, if ultimately supported, would require significant revision of what we thought we understood about the relationship between brain size and complex behavior. Sit with that for a moment. A being with a brain a third the size of yours, carrying its dead into the dark of a cave, placing them there with something that looked like intention. Whether or not that behavior qualifies as the kind of ritual we would recognize, it is evidence of something we do not yet have a clean word for. Something that existed before us, alongside us. In a world we thought we understood. Now travel from South Africa to Eastern China. In 2019, a research team led by Xiuji Wu published a detailed analysis of a skull from a site called Hualongdong in Anhui Province. The skull dated to approximately 300,000 years before the present. Roughly contemporary, with Jebel Irhoud and with the Broken Hill individual. And like both of those specimens, it presented a combination of features that did not fit neatly into existing categories. The lower face was strikingly modern. The chin, that small forward projection of the lower jaw that is one of the defining features of Homo sapiens and is absent in all earlier hominins, was present in an early form. The brain case retained characteristics associated with archaic hominin species. The combination placed this individual in a gap between categories, too modern in some features to be classified as a predecessor, too archaic in others to be classified as fully Homo sapiens. A site called Dali in Shaanxi Province produced a similar skull in 1978 that has been generating quiet debate in the paleoanthropology community ever since. Dated to approximately 200,000 to 260,000 years before the present. It shows a mosaic of features, some archaic, some surprisingly modern, that has resisted clean classification for decades. What these Chinese fossils collectively suggest is that the picture of human evolution in East Asia during this critical period is more complicated than the out-of-Africa model in its simplest form would predict. Several of them show modern features at dates that predate the arrival of an African-origin modern human population in the region by tens of thousands of years. Whether that reflects an early dispersal from Africa, independent evolution of similar features, or uncertainty in the dating that will eventually resolve, is a question the field is actively working on and has not yet answered. Then there is the case from Greece. In 2019, Katerina Harvati of the University of Tübingen and her team published a reanalysis of two skull fragments from Apodema Cave on the Mani Peninsula in southern Greece. The fragments had been excavated in the 1970s and had sat in storage for decades. Occasionally debated, but never subjected to the rigorous modern analysis that recent methodological advances made possible. The reanalysis used three-dimensional geometric morphometrics to assess what species each fragment belonged to. One showed characteristics consistent with a Neanderthal. The other showed characteristics consistent with a modern human. And that second fragment was dated to approximately 210,000 years before the present. If the identification and the dating are both correct, modern humans, or something very close to modern humans, were in southern Europe more than 200,000 years ago, far earlier than the standard account had placed them. The finding was published in Nature and generated immediate and sustained debate. Some researchers accepted the morphometric analysis. Others argued that the fragmentary nature of the specimen made confident identification impossible. The debate has not been resolved. Apodema remains in the literature as a seriously discussed and genuinely contested data point. What Broken Hill and Homo naledi and Hualongdong and Apodema share is a quality that makes them both scientifically valuable and deeply uncomfortable. They fit poorly into the existing framework without definitively breaking it. Each one can be explained away individually. But when you place them in the same room and look at the pattern of poor fit across multiple continents and multiple time periods, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. Someone was living in that Zambian cave nearly 300,000 years ago. Someone was carrying their dead into the dark of rising star at almost exactly the same time. Someone was walking through southern China with a chin that should not have existed yet. Someone was in southern Greece 200,000 years ago and left behind part of a skull that still cannot be cleanly explained. They were all alive at roughly the same moment. They were all different from each other and different from us. And the world they shared was considerably more populated with different kinds of human beings than the story most of us learned. The framework was built from bones that agreed with it. These are the bones that are still asking questions. The framework has not fully answered. Chapter 3. The dating problem. Before a fossil can challenge a timeline, it has to be placed on one. And placing a fossil on a timeline is considerably more complicated than it might appear from the outside. The date on a museum label. The number cited in a journal abstract. The figure repeated in science articles. That number is the end product of a process involving multiple methods, significant uncertainty, and interpretive choices that different researchers can make differently and reach different conclusions. Understanding how dating works and where it can go wrong is not a detour from this story. It is the center of it. Because the most significant claims in human origins, science almost always turn on a date. And the most important question you can ask about any significant finding is not whether the fossil is real. It obviously is. The question is whether the date attached to it is reliable, and what that date actually means. The most widely known dating method is radiocarbon dating, and it is also the most widely misunderstood. Radiocarbon measures the decay of a radioactive isotope of carbon that is incorporated into the tissues of living organisms and begins decaying at a known rate after death. By measuring how much remains in a sample, researchers can calculate how long ago the organism died. The method is genuinely powerful for the time range it covers. But that range has a ceiling. After roughly 50,000 years, the amount remaining in a sample is too small to measure reliably. Radiocarbon cannot be used for fossils older than approximately 50,000 years. For specimens like the Broken Hill skull, hundreds of thousands of years old, radiocarbon is simply not an option. For older material, researchers turn to other methods. Uranium series dating measures the decay of uranium isotopes in calcium carbonate materials like cave formations and tooth enamel. Electron spin resonance measures the accumulation of trapped electrons in tooth enamel caused by natural radiation from surrounding sediment. Thermoluminescence and optically stimulated luminescence measure the accumulated radiation dose in mineral grains, resetting when the grains are exposed to heat or light and beginning to accumulate again from that moment. Each method works on different materials, over different time ranges, with different sources of potential error. The critical point is that each method is dating something specific. And what it is dating is not always exactly what the researcher wants to know. uranium series dating of a cave formation dates the formation of that mineral deposit, not the fossil found near it. Electron spin resonance of tooth enamel dates the tooth, but the tooth may have moved from its original location before coming to rest where it was found. Luminescence dating of sediment grains dates the last time those grains were exposed to light, which should be the moment of burial. But sediment can be disturbed and reburied in ways that give misleading results. The word paleoanthropologists use for this problem is context. A date without secure context is a number attached to an uncertainty that the number itself does not communicate. This is precisely what made the Broken Hill skull's age so uncertain for so long. The skull was found in 1921 during commercial mining operations, not during a controlled scientific excavation. The exact sediment layer it came from was not recorded with the precision that modern protocols would require. Previous age estimates, ranging from 200,000 to 500,000 years, were based largely on the inferred age of surrounding deposit, rather than on direct analysis of the fossil itself. That is a span of 300,000 years of uncertainty, roughly the entire duration of modern human existence, compressed into a single label reading very old. The 2020 analysis by Rainer Grun's team was significant specifically because it applied uranium series and electron spin resonance methods directly to the fossil, reducing the dependence on contextual inference that had made earlier estimates so wide. The resulting date of approximately 299,000 years, with a margin of error of around 25,000 years in either direction, is treated in the current literature as the best direct estimate available. Some researchers have noted that the specific sampling location on the fossil introduces some uncertainty, and the discussion continues. But the order of magnitude of the revision, from 500,000 years to roughly 300,000, is supported by the direct analysis in a way that the earlier estimates were not. That shift matters enormously. It is the difference between a distant ancestor and a contemporary. There is one historical case that illustrates both the promise and the danger of dating in human origins science with particular clarity. In 1866, a human skull was found during mining operations in Calaveras County in California, in a layer of gravel estimated to be several million years old. The California state geologist announced it as evidence that fully modern humans had been present in North America millions of years before any accepted timeline. The announcement generated significant controversy. He defended the find for years. The skull was eventually shown to be a relatively recent Native American skull that had been introduced into the old gravel layer after that layer was deposited. The date of the surrounding gravel was real. The association of the skull with that gravel was not. The Calaveras skull is cited in the history of paleoanthropology as an early example of intrusive burial, where a more recent individual ends up in older sediment, creating an apparent but false association between the individual and the age of the surrounding material. Intrusive burial is one of the most persistent sources of misleading dates in the fossil record, and it is genuinely difficult to rule out without careful stratigraphic analysis and multiple independent dating methods applied to the fossil itself. This is why, when a fossil produces a date that seems dramatically out of place, the first response of careful researchers is scrutiny rather than celebration. They ask whether the fossil was found in undisturbed sediment. They ask whether multiple independent methods were applied and whether they agree. They ask whether contamination has been ruled out. These questions are not skepticism for its own sake. They are the standard of evidence the field has developed because the stakes of getting a date wrong are high. A misattributed date propagates through the literature as other researchers build on it, creates apparent contradictions with well-established findings, and generates popular accounts that outlive the original error by decades. Now, consider what those standards mean for the broader problem this story is exploring. The Broken Hill skull is one of the relatively fortunate cases. A specimen prominent enough to attract the resources and attention needed for rigorous modern dating. but it is not alone in having spent decades with an age estimate based on contextual inference rather than direct analysis. Museum and university collections hold other hominin fossils from Africa and elsewhere, whose ages were established by the methods available at the time of their study and have not been revisited with the direct techniques that are now standard. The gap between what the labels say and what modern methods might reveal is, in many cases, genuinely unknown. Some of those fossils may turn out to be older than assumed. Some may turn out to be younger. Some may turn out to be contemporary, with populations they were assumed to predate. Just as the Broken Hill individual turned out to be contemporary with the first modern humans, each time a better date is applied to an old specimen. The question becomes, not just how old is this fossil, but who else was alive at the same time? And what does that tell us about the world they shared? That is the question the Broken Hill date opened. It is a question the field is still in the early stages of answering. Chapter 4. Multiregional Ghosts. There is a debate that ran through the center of human origins, science, for most of the 20th century. A debate so fundamental that it shaped how researchers asked every question, interpreted every fossil, and evaluated every competing claim. On one side was the out-of-Africa model, which held that modern humans evolved in Africa from a single ancestral population and spread outward, replacing the archaic hominin populations they encountered in Europe and Asia. On the other side was a model called multiregional evolution, developed most influentially by paleoanthropologist Milford Wolpoff of the University of Michigan, which held that modern humans did not simply replace the archaic populations of Eurasia, but evolved from them. Through a process of gradual change, connected across regions by the slow exchange of genetic material between neighboring populations, the multiregional model was not a fringe position. It was built on a genuine observation. The fossil record of East Asia showed what appeared to be a pattern of regional continuity. A set of anatomical features appearing in archaic hominins in China that seemed to persist into the modern human populations of the same region. If modern humans had simply marched out of Africa and replaced everyone they met, the multi-regional researchers argued, you would not expect to see that continuity. Then, ancient DNA arrived, and the debate shifted in ways that neither side had fully anticipated. The first ancient DNA extracted from Neanderthal remains, published by Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig in 1997, showed that Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA was distinctly different from that of modern humans. This was widely interpreted as strong support for the out-of-Africa model. The multi-regional model appeared to have lost its central empirical support, but the story did not end there. When full nuclear genome sequencing of Neanderthals became possible, the picture changed. In 2010, Pääbo's team published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome and compared it to living humans from around the world. The results surprised most researchers in the field. People of non-African ancestry carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. African populations carry essentially none. Think about what that means in human terms. Somewhere in Western Asia, probably in the Levant, where modern humans and Neanderthals are both known to have been present at roughly the same time. Two populations that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years encountered each other. They were different enough to be classified as separate species by the anatomical standards paleoanthropologists use. They were similar enough to have children together, and the descendants of those children carried Neanderthal DNA with them as they spread across Eurasia. That DNA is in the cells of most people alive today. This finding did not rehabilitate the multi-regional model in its original form. The genetic evidence still clearly supports African origin for the overwhelming majority of the modern human genome. But it demonstrated that replacement was not clean. Modern humans did not march through the world, leaving no trace of the people they displaced. They met them. In some cases, they became family. The discovery of the Denisovans extended this picture further than almost anyone had anticipated. In 2010, A fragment of a finger bone and a molar tooth recovered from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia yielded DNA that belonged to neither modern humans nor Neanderthals. The genetic distance from both was large enough to indicate a distinct population that had diverged from the Neanderthal lineage several 100,000 years earlier. This population was named the Denisovans. After the cave, what makes this discovery extraordinary is not just what it found. It is what it revealed about what had been missed. The Denisovans had been completely invisible to a century of systematic physical anthropology. Not because their remains were rare, though confirmed specimens are, but because no fossil attributed to them had ever been recognized as belonging to a distinct group. They were discovered entirely through genetic analysis of a single small bone, an entire branch of the human family tree. Real people who lived and loved and left descendants alive today was unknown to science until 15 years ago. In 2018, a bone fragment from that same Siberian cave was analyzed and found to belong to an individual with a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. She is known in the literature simply as Denny. Her parents came from two branches of the human family that had been diverging for several 100,000 years before they met in whatever landscape produced her. She is the only known direct evidence of interbreeding between two separate archaic human species, and she existed. The geographic signal of Denisovan DNA in living humans is striking. People from Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians carry approximately 4 to 6% Denisovan ancestry. The Eta Magbukan people of the Philippines carry even higher levels. East Asian populations carry small but detectable amounts. Western Eurasians and Africans carry essentially none. This distribution implies that as modern humans moved southward and eastward through Southeast Asia, they encountered Denisovan populations multiple times in multiple locations, and that interbreeding occurred in each of those encounters. The traces of those meetings are still present in the bodies of living people whose ancestors were involved. In 2019, a jawbone from the Tibetan Plateau, initially found by a monk in Baishia Karst Cave in the 1980s and then largely set aside, was identified through ancient protein analysis as Denisovan. It dated to approximately 160,000 years before the present. A population that had been known to science for less than a decade was now confirmed to have ranged from Siberia to Tibet to Southeast Asia across hundreds of thousands of years. Now bring the Broken Hill individual back into this picture. They lived in Africa at approximately the same time that Neanderthals and Denisovans were living in Europe and Asia. The same moment in geological time. Different continents. Studies of living African populations have identified genetic signals consistent with introgression from archaic hominin groups within Africa itself. Groups that have not been identified in the fossil record and may never be if their remains did not survive in the African climate. Geneticists call these ghost populations, groups whose existence is inferred from the patterns they left in the DNA of living people, but for whom no physical evidence has yet been found. Ghost populations are not hypothetical in the speculative sense. They are mathematically derived from the structure of genetic variation in populations we can study directly. The equations say that certain patterns of diversity can only be explained if a population with certain characteristics existed and contributed genes to the ancestors of the people those patterns appear in. They existed. They are gone. And they are still present, in ways that cannot be seen but can be measured, in the DNA of their descendants. The Broken Hill individual may have been one of these contributing populations, or they may have been on a separate branch that ended without contribution. The ancient DNA that would begin to answer that question has not yet been successfully extracted from the fossil, which is not surprising given the warm Zambian climate and the century of museum storage. But the question is now being asked in ways it could not have been asked before ancient DNA analysis existed, and the tools being developed to ask it are improving every year. The clean story of human origins, the one with a single arrow pointing from Africa outward, is not wrong. It is incomplete, and the places where it is incomplete are precisely the places where the most interesting human beings were living. The ones who left behind bones that do not fit, genes that persist without a name, and questions that the framework was not built to contain. Chapter 5. The Silence Explained. Here is the version of this story that travels fastest. Scientists found a human skull that does not fit the timeline. They published it quietly. The mainstream establishment either ignored it or let it sink, because acknowledging what it implies would threaten the careers and reputations of researchers who built their lives on the existing framework. The skull sits in a London museum because powerful institutions need it to stay there. That version is emotionally satisfying in the way that simple stories about powerful interests always are. It requires no technical knowledge to follow. It has a clear villain, and it is, in the specific way that the most durable misconceptions tend to be, almost entirely wrong, while containing one small true thing at its core. The small true thing is this: science is a human institution, and human institutions carry all the tendencies that human beings bring to everything they build. Researchers have careers they want to protect. Journals have reputations they want to maintain. Grant committees fund the projects most likely to produce results consistent with the frameworks those committees were trained in. There is real sociological inertia in science, a genuine tendency to receive findings that confirm existing frameworks more easily than findings that challenge them. That tendency is real. It has been studied. It has been named. It is called confirmation bias, and it affects scientists the same way it affects everyone else, which is to say it affects them despite their training and their intentions and their genuine commitment to following the evidence. But inertia is not suppression. And the difference between those two things is the difference between an honest description of how science works and a conspiracy theory dressed in scientific language. Consider the actual history of the Broken Hill skull after the 2020 dating paper was published. Rainer Grün and his team placed their finding in the journal Nature, one of the highest-profile scientific publications in the world. The paper was not buried in an obscure venue. Researchers in the field read it, cited it, and engaged with it. Papers building on the new date appeared in subsequent literature. The implications for our understanding of archaic hominin diversity in Africa were actively discussed at conferences and in print. Some researchers raised questions about specific aspects of the methodology. Others found the result robust and called for similar direct dating to be applied to other African specimens. That is not what suppression looks like. That is what a field responding to a significant finding looks like. With the mixture of engagement, scrutiny, and ongoing discussion that findings of this weight always generate, what the paper did not do was immediately transform the standard account of human origins. And this is where the expectation and the reality of how science works diverge most sharply. A single finding, however well dated and carefully analyzed, does not by itself rewrite a framework built from hundreds of converging lines of evidence. It adds a data point. It raises question. It may, over time, accumulate the support needed to shift the consensus. But the consensus does not move for a single data point, regardless of how striking that data point appears. This standard exists for reasons that are worth understanding rather than resenting. The history of paleoanthropology includes numerous cases where a single dramatic finding was initially interpreted as requiring major revision of the accepted framework and was subsequently shown to be misidentified, misstated, or taken out of stratigraphic context. The Calaveras skull, discussed in the previous chapter, is one example. A more recent case involves the Liujiang skull from China, cited for years in support of early modern human presence in East Asia, but whose stratigraphic context was later shown to be insufficiently documented to support the dates attributed to it. Each of these cases represents a moment where the field applied its standards of evidence and found that the dramatic interpretation could not be sustained. Those standards exist not to protect the careers of established researchers, but to protect the integrity of the accumulating record. A field that revised its consensus for every anomalous finding would produce an account of human origins that was constantly in motion, impossible to build on, and ultimately less useful than one that changes slowly and for documented reasons. There is a historical case that illustrates the distinction between real scientific caution and genuine institutional resistance with particular clarity. For decades, the conventional view held that the Americas were populated no earlier than approximately 13,000 years ago, by people who crossed from Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. Researchers who proposed earlier human presence faced significant skepticism and, in some cases, professional friction. The atmosphere around this debate was, by some accounts, more resistant than the evidence alone warranted. But they kept publishing. Tom DeLahaye and his team, working across multiple seasons at a site called Monteverde in southern Chile, produced evidence of human presence dated to approximately 14,500 years ago. The evidence was subjected to extensive scrutiny and eventually accepted. The consensus shifted. It did not shift overnight, and the researchers who had held the previous view did not yield cheerfully. But they yielded because the evidence required it. That is the mechanism. Not conspiracy and not perfect openness. A system that resists change proportionally to how much change is being requested, and eventually yields when the evidence is robust enough to support the weight of what it is asking the field to accept. The Broken Hill skull's new date is in that process right now. The date places the Broken Hill individual as a contemporary of the earliest modern humans rather than a distant ancestor. That is a significant claim. It will be supported or complicated by the broader pattern of evidence that emerges as more African fossils are directly dated. As ancient protein analysis is applied to specimens that have resisted DNA extraction, as the full picture of archaic hominin diversity in Africa during this critical period comes into better focus, that process takes time. It takes resources. It takes the kind of sustained attention across multiple research programs that a single paper, however significant, cannot by itself generate. The silence around the Broken Hill date in popular science coverage is partly this: a field that does not revise its consensus for single findings, waiting for the pattern that single findings are part of to become clear enough to support revision. And it is partly something more ordinary. Scientific findings that complicate clean stories are harder to communicate to general audiences than findings that confirm them. And harder to communicate means less likely to reach the people who would care most about them. The skull is in London. The date is published. The person it belonged to woke up in Zambia nearly 300,000 years ago and has been waiting, with the patience that only stone possesses, for the question that will finally tell their story. That question is being asked now. It is just being asked slowly, carefully, and without the drama that the story deserves, but that the evidence, honestly handled, cannot yet fully support. Chapter 6. What ancient DNA changed forever? There is a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, where the air itself is filtered before it reaches the samples being processed inside. The researchers who work there wear full-body suits, gloves, and face masks. They move carefully, methodically, with the deliberate attention of people who understand that a single careless moment can contaminate a sample with modern DNA and render irretrievable something that took thousands of years to preserve. The precautions are not theater. They are the minimum required to do the work at all. This is the ancient DNA laboratory of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. And what was discovered there, over roughly 20 years of increasingly refined work, changed the field of human origins science more profoundly than any single fossil find in the previous century. To understand why, you need to understand what ancient DNA actually is, and what it is not. When an organism dies, the processes that maintained its DNA during life stop. Enzymes begin breaking the long strands of genetic material into shorter and shorter fragments. Bacteria consume organic material including DNA. Water, oxygen, and ultraviolet light accelerate the degradation. Under normal conditions, in a temperate climate, with moderate humidity. Essentially, no readable DNA survives in biological remains after roughly 100,000 years, under exceptional conditions, in permafrost, in very dry caves, in environments where the chemistry of sediment inhibits bacterial activity. DNA can survive longer. Though always in fragmentary form, the DNA that ancient DNA researchers work with is not the intact double helix of a living cell. It is a collection of short, damaged fragments, chemically modified at their ends in ways that actually help researchers distinguish genuine ancient DNA from modern contamination. Reading an ancient genome means assembling millions of these tiny fragments, aligning them against a reference sequence, and inferring the original structure from the pattern of what is there. It is closer to reconstructing a shredded letter from its pieces than to reading a book that was kept in a drawer. The field learned its methods the hard way. Early attempts in the 1980s to recover DNA from museum specimens produced dramatic claims. DNA from Egyptian mummies, from insects in amber, from plant material millions of years old. Almost all of these results were later shown to be contamination. Modern DNA that had found its way into ancient samples and been amplified instead of or alongside the genuine ancient material. The field developed rigorous authentication criteria from those failures. The characteristic chemical damage patterns of genuine ancient DNA were identified and used to filter out the noise. When Svante Pabo and his team applied these refined methods to Neanderthal remains through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, the results they produced were genuinely ancient in ways the earlier claims had not been. The publication of the first draft Neanderthal genome in 2010 was a scientific event of the first order. Not because it confirmed that Neanderthals existed, which a century of fossil study had established, but because it revealed something about the relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans that no amount of looking at bones could ever have shown. Neanderthals and modern humans had children together. The evidence was in the genomes of living non-African humans, who carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal ancestry. The specific pattern of that ancestry, present in Europeans and East Asians, but absent in Africans, indicated that the interbreeding happened after modern humans left Africa, but before the populations that would eventually become Europeans and Asians had diverged from each other. The most likely location was the Middle East, where both populations are known to have been present at roughly the same time. But the genetic legacy of that meeting was not simply carried forward unchanged. Some of the Neanderthal DNA retained in modern human genomes is not randomly distributed. Certain Neanderthal gene variants appear at higher frequencies than would be expected by chance, suggesting they conferred some advantage to the individuals who carried them. Immune system genes, in particular, show evidence of positive selection for Neanderthal variants. The people who carried those variants may have been better equipped to resist pathogens present in Western Asia and Europe that their purely African ancestry relatives had never encountered. The useful parts of the Neanderthal genome were incorporated into the modern human lineage, not by design, but by the ordinary pressure of survival in a new landscape. The Neanderthals are gone. Their contribution is not. The Denisovan discovery extended this picture in a direction no one had anticipated. When the finger bone from Denisova cave yielded a genome belonging to neither modern humans nor Neanderthals, the immediate question was how widespread this unknown group had been. The answer came not from finding more Denisovan fossils, though a few additional fragments were eventually identified, but from reading the genomes of living people across the world and asking where Denisovan ancestry appeared. The answer produced one of the most striking geographic patterns in the entire ancient DNA literature. People from Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians carry approximately 4 to 6% Denisovan ancestry. The Aita Magbukon people of the Philippines carry even higher levels. East Asian populations carry small but detectable amounts. Western Eurasian and African populations carry essentially none. The distribution implies that as modern humans moved southward and eastward through Southeast Asia, they encountered Denisovans multiple times in multiple locations. and that interbreeding occurred in each of those encounters. But if Denisovans were present across this enormous geographic range, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, why is the fossil record almost empty? Why do we have only a handful of bone fragments from a single Siberian cave, plus one jawbone from Tibet, to represent a population that was apparently widespread across much of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years? The most likely answer is preservation. Tropical and subtropical environments are hostile to the survival of organic material. The hot, humid conditions of Southeast Asia destroy bone within centuries in many cases. The Siberian cave and the Tibetan plateau were exceptional preservation environments. They gave us a glimpse of a population whose main range lay in exactly the kind of environment where preservation is worst. A gene variant that the Tibetans carry, one that helps regulate the body's response to low oxygen levels and allows them to live and work at high altitude without the health problems that affect lowland people at elevation, was acquired from Denisovans. The analysis, published in 2014, showed that the Tibetan version of this gene was refined over hundreds of thousands of years of Denisovan adaptation to high-altitude environments and then passed to the people who would become Tibetan through interbreeding. Natural selection drove it to high frequency in the Tibetan population because it worked. The Denisovans gave the Tibetans the ability to breathe on the roof of the world. The Denisovans themselves left almost no other trace that we have found. Now, hold that thought and bring it back to the Broken Hill individual in London. The Broken Hill skull dates to approximately 299,000 years ago. Its DNA, if any, survives after a century of museum storage and the warm Zambian climate that preceded its excavation, has not yet been successfully sequenced. Ancient protein analysis, which survives longer than DNA in warm climate conditions and can establish the biological affinity of a specimen, has not yet been systematically applied to it. The full biological picture of who this individual was, how they relate to the modern humans who were their African contemporaries, and whether their population contributed anything to the ancestry of people alive today, is still waiting for the tools that are being developed and refined right now. Studies of living African populations have already identified genetic signals consistent with introgression from archaic hominin groups within Africa itself. Groups that have left no confirmed fossil record and may never leave one if their remains did not survive in the African climate. These ghost populations, inferred from the structure of genetic variation in living Africans, contributed to the ancestry of modern Africans at various points in the deep past. Whether the Broken Hill individual's population was among them, or whether their line ended without contribution, is a question that ancient protein analysis and improved DNA extraction methods may eventually be able to approach. The ancient DNA field barely existed 20 years ago. In that time, it has already discovered the Denisovans, confirmed that modern humans interbred with multiple archaic populations on multiple continents, revealed ghost populations that contributed to the ancestry of living Africans without leaving any physical trace, and shown that a specific gene variant from an archaic population is still doing work in the bodies of the people who inherited it. Every year, the methods improve. Every year, more specimens become analyzable that were not analyzable the year before. Every year, the family tree of our species grows more branches, more connections, more evidence of a past that was considerably more complex and considerably more human than the version most of us were taught. The machine in Leipzig is still running. The past is still giving up its secrets, one degraded fragment at a time. And somewhere in a London museum, in a climate-controlled storage room, a skull that has been waiting for over 100 years is one step closer to telling us who it was. Chapter 7. The coastlines no one mapped. Stand at the edge of the ocean on any coast in the world and look out at the water. Now, imagine the water is not there. Not a drought. Not a tide going out further than usual. Imagine the entire ocean has dropped by approximately 120 meters, roughly 400 feet, and what is currently seafloor has been exposed as dry land. What you would see is not a barren mudflat. It would be a landscape, with rivers running across it, with valleys and plains and hills, with soil capable of supporting vegetation, with coastal and estuarine environments of the kind that are among the richest available to any population living by hunting, fishing, and gathering. This is not imagination. It is history. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 to 26,000 years ago, the water currently in the world's oceans was substantially locked in the massive ice sheets covering much of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. The coastlines of every continent extended significantly further out to sea, and the shallow continental shelves that border those coastlines, currently submerged, were land. The scale of that exposed land was enormous. The South China Sea, currently a body of water, was largely dry. The landmass now forming the Malay Peninsula extended southward to connect with Sumatra, Java, and Borneo into a single landmass geologists call Sundaland. This was not a narrow land bridge. Sundaland was a subcontinent, comparable in area to Western Europe, with river systems, forests, wetlands, and coastlines that would have supported human populations for as long as people had been in the region. The shallow shelf between Australia and New Guinea was exposed, connecting them into a single continent geologists call Sahul. The Torres Strait between Australia and New Guinea, currently a body of water, was dry land. Human beings were living on these land masses. We know this because their descendants were still there when the sea rose and covered the margins, and the populations that had lived in the interior survived by moving to higher ground as the coastlines retreated. But the people who lived on the coastlines and lowlands themselves, who had built their lives in those environments over tens of thousands of years, did not have that option. The sea rose slowly by human generational timescales, meters over centuries, but relentlessly. Communities that had been on the coast found themselves further from the shore. Then, further still, eventually the land they had known was gone, covered by water that would not recede. Whatever those communities had built along those coastlines is now on the continental shelf, under tens to hundreds of meters of water. Think about what that means for the question this story has been asking. The Broken Hill individual lived in Africa, approximately 299,000 years ago. But the period from 200,000 to 500,000 years ago, the period when the Broken Hill individual and their contemporaries were alive, was a period of repeated glacial cycles, each one lowering sea levels and exposing coastal land, each one raising them again as the ice melted. The African coastline during glacial periods extended further out than it does today, and the continental shelf off both the west and east coasts of Africa includes areas that were dry land during those glacial periods. Human populations living in those coastal and lowland zones left behind a material record that is now underwater. This matters because the picture of archaic hominin diversity in Africa during this critical period is based on a remarkably small number of specimens from a remarkably small number of locations, almost all of them from interior sites where geological exposure happened to preserve and reveal the remains. The coastal and lowland environments where populations would have been densest, because those environments are richest in food resources, are precisely the environments most likely to have been submerged by subsequent sea level changes. We are trying to understand who was alive in Africa during the period when modern humans were emerging. And we are doing it with a fossil record that has been systematically biased away from the places where the most people were living. The North Sea between Britain and continental Europe was dry land during the glacial maximum. The plain that connected them, called Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, where North Sea fishermen have long dredged up mammoth bones and ancient tools in their nets, was finally fully submerged approximately 6,500 years before the present. Doggerland was a rich environment for its human occupants, with large river systems and wetlands and coastal areas that would have supported substantial populations. Those populations moved as the sea rose. But the landscape they left behind is preserved in the sediment of the North Sea floor. The Submerged Landscapes Research Center at the University of Bradford has spent years mapping that landscape using seismic survey data originally collected by the oil and gas industry. The surveys record the structure of sediment layers below the seafloor, revealing ancient river channels, lake beds, and the outlines of the former landscape in enough detail to reconstruct the geography of Doggerland and identify where Mesolithic settlements are most likely to be found. The mapping has covered nearly 200,000 square kilometers of the North Sea floor. What has been recovered from the North Sea so far comes primarily from fishing nets and targeted sampling. It includes human remains, animal bones, worked, flint, and organic material that has yielded ancient DNA. A barbed antler point, the kind of tool used for spearfishing, was recovered from the seafloor at a depth suggesting it was deposited when the area was still a freshwater or estuarine environment. These are fragments, but they confirm that the landscape was inhabited, that its people left material traces, and that some of those traces have survived. In the Persian Gulf, the situation carries a particular resonance. The Gulf is shallow, averaging only about 35 meters in depth. During the glacial maximum, it was dry land, a river valley through which the Tigris, Euphrates, and other rivers flowed together toward the Indian Ocean. Researcher Jeffrey Rose of the University of Birmingham has proposed that this valley may have served as a refugium during periods of extreme aridity in the surrounding region, a place where water remained available when the surrounding landscape was desiccated, and that human populations may have concentrated there during difficult periods and dispersed outward when conditions improved. The Gulf flooded from the Indian Ocean approximately 7,500 years ago. Whatever had accumulated in the valley over the tens of thousands of years of its occupation was inundated within a period of centuries. The flooding was rapid enough by geological standards that it may have been experienced as catastrophic by the people living in its lower reaches. The oral tradition of a catastrophic flood that ended a world has been documented across the cultures of the surrounding region in texts that predate the biblical account by thousands of years. Whether those accounts preserve a genuine memory of the flooding of the Gulf, transmitted through generations until scribes wrote it in cuneiform, or whether they reflect independent development of a narrative structure common to many cultures, is a question the evidence does not yet resolve. The correspondence is real. The interpretation remains open. What is not open is the basic geological fact. The land is underwater. The people who lived on it left a material record. That record is on a seafloor that has never been systematically surveyed with the methods that would allow us to read it. The coastlines no one mapped are not empty. They are full of evidence sitting in sediment underwater that has been there for thousands of years. The technology to approach that evidence is being developed. The University of Bradford's work on Doggerland demonstrates that the survey methods exist. The excavation methods are being refined. And, every year that passes, the gap between what we know about the human past and what the human past actually contained grows smaller. The water is not a wall. It is an archive. And archives, unlike the people who create them, have the patience to wait. Chapter 8. The Sites That Moved the Line. Every framework has a moment when the weight of what does not fit becomes too heavy to carry without changing shape. Not a dramatic collapse. Not the moment when everything believed is abandoned overnight. The breaking point of a scientific framework is subtler than that. It is the accumulation of findings that strain the existing account until the account itself has to flex to contain them. The framework bends. And when it has bent far enough, in enough places, it has become something different from what it was. Something closer to the truth than the version that preceded it. Human origins science has bent several times in the past 2 decades. Each time, the bending came from a specific site, excavated by specific people, argued over in specific journals. The drama of the revision is real. The mechanism is ordinary. It is science doing what science does when the evidence is persistent enough. The site of Majid Beeb in the Northern Territory of Australia sits on the edge of Kakadu, in a landscape that has been occupied continuously for longer than almost any other place on Earth where that claim can be made with confidence. It is a rock shelter formed by an overhanging sandstone cliff, the kind of protected space that accumulates sediment slowly and preserves what is left in each layer with exceptional fidelity. The earliest systematic excavation of Majid Beeb was carried out in the 1980s by Rhys Jones and his team. They recovered stone tools from deep layers and produced dates suggesting human occupation significantly earlier than what was then accepted for the colonization of Australia. Those dates were contested. Questions were raised about whether tools from upper layers might have been displaced downward by the burrowing of animals and the growth of plant roots. The work was noted and then largely set aside. In 2017, Chris Clarkson of the University of Queensland led a new excavation that returned to Majid Beeb with 30 years of methodological refinement behind it. The team recorded the precise three-dimensional position of every artifact, took sediment samples for analysis that would reveal any evidence of disturbance, and applied optically stimulated luminescence, dating to mineral grains from multiple layers throughout the deposit. The results were unambiguous enough to publish. The lowest layers at Majid Beeb, containing the earliest stone tools, dated to between 65,000 and 80,000 years before the present. The sediment analysis showed no evidence of significant disturbance in the relevant layers. The tools had not moved. They were where they had been placed, by hands that held them 65,000 years ago. The previous consensus had placed the arrival of modern humans in Australia at approximately 47,000 to 50,000 years ago. The Majid Beeb results moved that date back by at least 15,000 years. A revision of roughly 30%. The implication was immediate and cascading. If modern humans were in Australia 65,000 years ago, they had to have been moving through South and Southeast Asia before that, which meant the dispersal from Africa began earlier than the simplest version of the out-of-Africa model had assumed. The framework bent to accommodate this. The dates were debated, examined, and eventually accepted as the best current evidence for the timing of Australian colonization. The timeline moved. Now travel to Fuyan Cave in Daoxian County in Hunan Province in southern China. In 2015, Wu Lu of the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology in Beijing published the analysis of 47 human teeth recovered from cave deposits. The teeth were unambiguously modern in their morphology. The dating of the cave deposits, using uranium series methods applied to cave formations, sealing the layer containing the teeth, produced a minimum age of 80,000 years before the present. The actual age of the deposit was likely older, possibly as much as 120,000 years. Modern human teeth in southern China, dated to at least 80,000 years ago. If the dating is sound, these teeth predate the main out-of-Africa dispersal documented in the genetics by tens of thousands of years. The people who left these teeth were in southern China before the ancestors of most living non-African humans had left Africa. There are several possible explanations. An early dispersal from Africa, a wave that reached East Asia before the main wave, and then either went extinct or contributed too little to be clearly visible in living genomes. Features that appear modern in the dental record, but belong to a population that was not fully modern in the genetic sense, or a source of dating error that has not yet been identified. Wu Lu and his colleagues presented the findings with careful attention to this uncertainty. The field engaged with the results seriously, raised methodological questions, and has not yet resolved them. The Fuyan teeth remain in the literature as a significant and genuinely contested data point. Then there is apodema, which this story has already visited. The skull fragment from southern Greece dated to approximately 210,000 years before the present and identified by Katerina Harvati's team as having modern human morphological affinities. If the identification and dating are both correct, modern humans, or something very close to modern humans, were in Europe more than 200,000 years ago. During a period when Neanderthals are understood to have been the established inhabitants of the continent, the most plausible explanation for why these early populations left no lasting genetic trace in subsequent European populations is extinction. Small, isolated groups moving into environments dominated by well-adapted Neanderthal populations may have simply not survived in sufficient numbers to maintain themselves. They died out, leaving their bones but not their genes. The main wave of modern human expansion. The genetics documents as the primary source of non-African ancestry, would then represent not the first time modern humans left Africa, but the first time they did so in numbers and with the ecological flexibility sufficient to persist and eventually displace the populations they encountered. Now, place all of these sites next to the Broken Hill skull and look at them together. The Broken Hill individual was alive in Africa approximately 299,000 years ago. Homo naledi was alive in the same continent at roughly the same time. Modern human teeth were present in southern China within 100,000 years of that date. Modern human cranial morphology was apparently present in southern Greece 210,000 years ago. And the genetic record tells us that when modern humans did leave Africa in significant numbers, they encountered and interbred with archaic populations on multiple continents. Populations that had been living in those regions for hundreds of thousands of years. The picture that emerges from holding all of these findings together is not clean. It is not the story of a single population in Africa, developing modern anatomy and then spreading outward into a world of clearly different predecessors. It is a story of multiple lineages living simultaneously across the old world. Some of them exchanging genes, and some of them apparently not. Some of them going extinct, and some persisting long enough to leave their mark in the DNA of people alive today. The Broken Hill individual is one figure in that crowded picture. Not the most dramatic, and not the most complete, but the date on their skull, established by rigorous direct analysis in 2020, connects them to a moment in time when the world was considerably more occupied with different kinds of human beings than the clean timeline of Out of Africa has typically conveyed. Every revision has moved the line in the same direction. Further back in time. More widely distributed. More people. Of more kinds. Living in more places than the previous version of the story allowed. Chapter 9. What the Skull in London Means. Come back to the Natural History Museum in London. The Broken Hill skull has been there since 1921. It arrived from a mine in Zambia, passed through the hands of researchers who looked at it with the tools and assumptions of their time, was assigned to a category and a rough age, and then settled into the long institutional life of a significant specimen, studied periodically, cited regularly, understood within a framework that was built around other fossils and other questions. For most of that century, it was understood as old. Comfortably. Safely old. A representative of the deep archaic past that preceded us by a wide margin of geological time. A marker of where we came from, rather than a member of the world we came from. The 2020 direct dating analysis changed that understanding. Not dramatically. Not overnight, but in the specific way that a new measurement changes the meaning of something that has been sitting on a shelf for a long time. The skull did not change. What changed was the precision of the question we could ask of it, and the answer to the more precise question placed this person, the one who woke up in Zambia nearly 300,000 years ago, at exactly the moment when the first people who looked like us were alive. Think about what that means in human terms rather than geological ones. Somewhere in Morocco, approximately 299,000 years ago, the individuals whose remains were eventually found at Jebel Irhoud were living their lives. They had the high rounded brain cases and the flat faces and the chins of people who would be recognizable to us somewhere else on the same continent. The person whose skull now sits in a London museum was living their life. They looked different. Their brow ridges projected forward. Their skull was long and low, by the anatomical standards we use to define our species. They were not one of us, but they were alive at the same time, on the same continent, in a world that was fully real to both of them. Whether those two populations ever met, whether they shared roots or resources or anything more, is a question the current evidence cannot answer. Whether the Broken Hill individual's population contributed to the ancestry of any living person, whether something of that person is still present in the DNA of people alive today, is a question that ancient protein analysis and improved extraction methods may eventually begin to approach. What the date does establish, clearly and without dramatic overreach, is that the emergence of our species was not a clean event in which a single modern population appeared and then spread into a world of inferior predecessors. It was something messier, more complex, and, in some ways, more interesting than that. Multiple lineages coexisted in Africa during the period when modern humans were emerging. Some of those lineages may have contributed to us. Some may have ended without contribution. The full picture of who was alive in Africa during this critical period is still being assembled, one direct date at a time. Museum and university collections hold other hominin fossils from Africa whose ages were established by methods available at the time of their study and have not been revisited with the direct techniques that are now standard. Researchers working in this area have noted in published literature that a significant number of important African fossil specimens have age estimates derived primarily from the inferred age of surrounding sediment rather than from direct analysis of the fossils themselves. The gap between those inferred estimates and what direct modern dating might reveal is, in many cases, genuinely unknown. Ancient protein analysis is now being applied to specimens that have resisted DNA extraction because of warm climate degradation. Geometric morphometric reanalysis of fossils assessed with older methods is producing revised classifications of specimens whose affinities were previously ambiguous. The backlog of specimens awaiting reanalysis with these modern methods is real, and working through it systematically has the potential to change the picture of early African hominin diversity in ways that a single paper, however significant, cannot accomplish alone. The Broken Hill skull is one piece of that picture. It is sitting in London, in a storage room, carrying a date that places it in a conversation that the standard account had not previously made room for. The date was established by the best methods currently available. The discussion it opened is ongoing. That is not failure. That is how science builds towards something true. One careful measurement at a time. One revised estimate at a time. One question asked of an old specimen with a new tool at a time. The skull in London is not a secret. It is not suppressed. It is a specimen in a collection, doing what significant specimens do, waiting for the next question that will tell us a little more about the person it once was, and the world that person shared with the first people who looked like us. That next question may be closer than the quiet suggests. Chapter 10. The story is not finished. Somewhere tonight, in a laboratory that most people have never heard of, a machine is running. It does not look like the technology of revelation. It looks like laboratory equipment, unremarkable from the outside, doing its work in a room that smells of filtered air and careful process. But inside it, something ancient is being read. Tiny fragments of protein or DNA extracted from a specimen that has been in a collection for decades. Their chemical structure translated into data that will be compared against thousands of other results from specimens living and ancient, recent and impossibly old. What the machine will return when it finishes is not yet known. That is the point. The work is happening precisely because the answer is not yet known. We have spent this night following a single person. The individual whose skull was found in a Zambian mine in 1921, through the full landscape of what human origins science knows and does not know, and is in the process of finding out. We began with a morning in Zambia 300,000 years ago. A person waking up in a world that had no name for them yet, carrying a brain behind a face that would one day be studied in a museum in London. Living in the same geological moment as the first modern humans on the same continent. We trace the framework that their new date complicates, built over 150 years of careful work. We spent time with the other finds that fit poorly into that framework. Homo naledi, with its ancient-looking brain and its apparently deliberate burials, carrying its dead into the dark of Rising Star Cave at almost exactly the same time the Broken Hill individual was alive. The Chinese fossils, with their mosaic of modern and archaic features, presenting interpretive challenges, the field has not yet resolved. The skull fragment from a Greek cave that places something very close to modern morphology in Europe more than 200,000 years ago. We followed ancient DNA through the clean rooms of Leipzig and found that it had revealed an entire branch of the human family tree that a century of physical anthropology had completely missed. A finger bone from a Siberian cave. A daughter with a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. A gene variant that helps Tibetans breathe at altitude. Inherited from a population that left almost no other trace. We stood at the edge of submerged continents and acknowledged that the densest human occupation zones of the deep past are sitting on seafloors that have never been surveyed. We watched specific sites move the boundary of the known, each time in the same direction, and we came back to London, to a storage room in a museum, where a skull has been sitting for over 100 years, carrying a date that connects the person it belonged to the moment when the first people who looked like us were alive. Here is what all of that adds up to. Stated as plainly as the evidence supports, the human past is older, more complex, and more populated with different kinds of human beings than what most of us were taught. The record we have is not the complete record. It is what survived in the interior sites that happen to be above sea level and in the geological settings that happen to preserve bone. From the fraction of those sites that have been found. From the fraction of found sites that have been studied. From the fraction of studied specimens that have been subjected to the best analytical methods currently available. The people who lived in the rest of that record were fully alive, fully capable, and fully present in their lives in ways that the distances of time have made hard to feel but have not actually diminished. The Broken Hill individual woke up in Zambia nearly 300,000 years ago. They moved through a world that was real to them. They lived in it, learned it, and left it. They left behind one fragment of bone that survived a mine blast and a century of institutional storage and 100 years of changing science. And that fragment now carries a date that places them in a conversation about who we are and where we came from, that their existence was always part of. The title of tonight's story promises a skull that should not exist, and a silence that followed. The evidence delivers something more complicated and more honest than that framing suggests. The skull exists. The date is published and treated as a serious, direct dating finding in the scientific literature. The silence that followed in popular coverage is not the silence of suppression. It is the silence of a field that does not revise its consensus for single findings. That waits for the broader pattern of evidence those findings are part of to become clear enough to support the revision that the findings point toward. That pattern is becoming clearer. The direction it points is toward more complexity, more diversity, more ancient presence, and more contact between populations that the older versions of the story had separated by clean boundaries of time and space. The Broken Hill date is consistent with that direction. It is one more measurement in an accumulating argument that the field is still in the early stages of fully absorbing the analytical tools that would allow the next questions to be asked of the Broken Hill skull directly are being developed and refined right now. Ancient protein analysis is extending the reach of biochemical investigation into warm climate specimens that have resisted DNA sequencing. Improved dating protocols are being applied to African fossils whose ages have long been uncertain. Geometric morphometrics are being used to reanalyze specimens whose classifications were established before quantitative shape analysis existed. The Herculaneum scrolls sat in a museum in Naples for 2 centuries before the imaging technology existed to read them without destroying them. When the technology arrived, 2,000 years of silence ended in the span of a research competition. The scrolls had not changed. The knowledge inside them had not degraded. The world simply was not ready to read them until it was. The Denisovans existed. They gave the Tibetans the ability to breathe at altitude. An entire branch of the human family tree was invisible to a century of systematic archaeological effort and was found only through a single genetic test. If that was possible, the question of what else might be invisible to our current methods is not rhetorical. It is the question driving the field forward right now. Somewhere tonight, a machine is processing ancient proteins from a fossil that has been in a collection since before the researchers analyzing it were born. Somewhere tonight, a laser is scanning the floor of a sea that has not been dry land since before the first writing system was invented. Somewhere tonight, a researcher is opening a cabinet in a museum and looking at a specimen that has been waiting with the patience that only stone possesses, for the question that will finally tell it what it means. The Broken Hill skull is in one of those cabinets. That person woke up in Zambia nearly 300,000 years ago. They lived under the same African sky that the first modern humans lived under. They did not know they would be the last of their kind, or that someone who came after them would eventually find what they left behind and spend 100 years trying to understand when they lived. The past is not behind us. It is beneath us. In the ground and on the ocean floor, and in the storage rooms of museums and in the cells of people alive right now. Carrying in their DNA the record of meetings and extinctions and survivals that no historical document has ever described. The skull is in the cabinet. The date is published. And the story of what that date means is still being written. One careful analysis at a time. By people who have devoted their lives to asking the ground what it remembers. The past is patient. It has been waiting a very long time. It can wait a little longer. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whatever time it is there, let your breathing slow. The questions are still open. And that is not a reason for unease. It is a reason for wonder. Sleep well. And dream deep. Good night.